I'd like to turn now to our next item on the agenda. This morning, we have the pleasure of welcoming former NSB member, Dr. Shirley Malcom of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. The topic of her talk today is timely as the board considers how to advance our missing millions goal, including the promise to improve the attractiveness, equity, and inclusivity of research careers. Dr. Malcom's presentation may also inform our ongoing discussions to improve the effectiveness of the broader impacts review criterion. And of course, it was really a suggestion from the Committee on Oversight to bring Dr. Malcom before the board today. So I want to turn the floor to Anila Sargent, the chair of our Committee on Oversight, for her to introduce Dr. Malcom.
I can't believe that I am still having to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Ellen, and welcome everyone. Obviously, we're now well set for today's special presentation. But before we start, I'd like to ask board members and others in attendance to please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones during the presentation. And actually, of course, it's a great pleasure for me, and I'm sure for all of us, to have one of the nation's foremost experts on diversity, equity, and inclusion in STEM here today. Dr. Shirley Malcom is at the Association for Advancement for Science, where she is senior advisor to the CEO and director of its STEMM Equity Achievement Change program. In fact, Dr. Malcom was also a member of the National Science Board from 1993 to 1998 and played a critical role in the adoption of the intellectual merit and broader impacts criteria for NSF's merit review that we now actually just take for granted. And a slightly longer biography can be found in our board book. Just before I begin, I'd like to say that following Dr. Malcom's presentation, I expect the board will have a lot of specific questions for her about building accountability for DEI diversity within NSF and its grantee institutions. I remind the board that there will be further opportunity for discussion of these issues in the Committee on Oversight open session this afternoon when NSF will present a summary of the 2020 Merit Review Digest. And with all that information, Shirley, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Anila. It's really an honor for me to be with you and to be able to share some of the information that relates to the sea change and to the review criteria and all the other things that that we have discussed. I entitled my presentation Investing in Human Potential. And this is the title of an old study that we did a long time ago to be able to talk about how to move forward. And I am not being able to sorry. That was hiding my, one of the little clips was hiding my, the button that I needed. It's an honor to join you. And I just want to give you a brief overview of sea change and the strategies that we're incorporating within sea change to really begin to move the needle. NSF has been involved in broadening participation issues for a long time. The 20th century efforts were very much a product of their times. Initially, with the civil rights movement of the early 1960s, there was a focus, for example, on supporting science within historically Black colleges and universities. This expanded in the 1970s to include other institutions serving under other underrepresented groups at that time. There was a focus on individuals in terms of providing funding for interventions. And these were, and also initiated in the late 1970s, graduate fellowships for minorities. There was effort to try to understand the landscape. What was it that was giving us the numbers that we had or not, with regard to girls and women, as well as racial and ethnic minorities in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And finally, the foundation was actually supporting intervention programs in these fields for persons with disabilities. But the interventions approaches that largely dominated the strategies that the foundation undertook were limited in terms of what it was possible for them to accomplish. And this was in part because the focus was on fixing the student, fixing the women, fixing the minorities, fixing anybody else, but really with little challenge to the structures that form the overall system. And that was the point where we knew that we had to be able to move forward. In a landscape review that we did at AAAS, Marsha Mattis and I did back in the late 1980s, in a publication in 1991, we developed this model for meaningful change. To show that, in fact, that much of what was going on were isolated programs, soft money funded, or with a lot of volunteer effort. It was dependent on institutional commitment. There was very little actually put in place at higher levels within colleges and universities to start to move the efforts forward. And so we ask ourselves, why hasn't the needle moved? And it is because of, to a certain extent, our fixation on fixing the people rather than fixing the system. But first thing that had to happen, however, was an acknowledgement that there were institutional biases that were in place that would keep the system from moving. We were all looking for approaches to try to catalyze systemic change. And one of the earliest ones actually came out of MIT and the MIT study. Many of you have heard about the efforts of Nancy Hopkins over the late 1990s. That were able to demonstrate in the way that little else possibly could, that there were systemic barriers. This was looking at the senior most women, the full professors who were by any stretch of the imagination highly capable, who were somehow feeling that there were differences there that they just could not grapple and couldn't get their hands around. And so when they began to study this, what they discovered was that there were differences, yes, differences in pay, differences in recognition, differences in resources, differences in space, even among the women full professors compared with the rest of the faculty that were there. And a lot of this is described in the documentary Picture of Scientists. And I think that probably a lot of you have likely seen that. But it was very useful in reminding us of the kinds of barriers and challenges that were being faced at that time. And I raised this because it was the first time that somebody's actually stepped up and said, we have an institutional problem. It is true that Bob Bergeneau, who was the dean at that time, and Chuck Vest, who was the president, moved quickly to remedy the situations. But they had this, for the women who were there, but they had this sense that they weren't the only ones with the problem. And so there was a reach out to other institutions and the creation of the MIT 9. But I will never forget the comment that Chuck actually made that was covered in a faculty newsletter, where he said, "I have always believed that contemporary gender discrimination within universities is part reality and part perception." True, but I now understand that reality is by far the greater part of the balance. And it was this acknowledgement of the reality of bias that really allowed us to have this kind of discussion beyond MIT, because this was not the response. What happened to raise this at MIT was not the response of the disgruntled, but the call out for fairness and justice. So we began to see, not only within the university community, but the few institutions, those within the 9 and a few others, who were starting to look at their own situations. Did they have the same problems with regard to pay equity or space allocation or resource allocation? And it was also around this time that NSF started Advance, that would allow that brought forward resources that began to look much more in terms of institutional structures. In 2005, the UK, with, again, very senior women frustrated at what was going on, they founded Athena Swan. And they stood up a process that began with institutional self-assessment, looking at those metrics internally to see whether or not there was fairness or whether there was bias. Subsequently, in 2015, they brought online the UK Race Equality Charter. And we, in 2017, adapted these charters, the Race Equality Charter and Athena Swan, we adapted them to form Sea Change. Now, Sea Change is the newcomer in this block. The Athena Swan has been around since 2015 and has been evaluated and has moved to help other places, other countries look at their situation. There is SAGE in Australia. There's Dimensions that came after us in Canada. Ireland has a similar Athena Swan effort, and India is exploring an Athena Swan effort as well. Now, I remember I said that Athena Swan started in 2005, but the real uptake in Athena Swan happened in 2011. It was at this time that Dame Professor Sally Davies, who was head of what's their equivalent of the National Institutes of Health, I think in a moment of frustration that things were not changing, really not changing, that she declared that in 4 years, the departments that came in to request funding would have to have at least a silver Athena Swan rating. All of a sudden, it got people's attention. And I think that the government had a salutary impact on the departments really starting to move, because they had 4 years to make these kinds of changes and to begin these processes internally. And it wasn't just the departments, because in order for a department to get a silver rating, this meant that the institutions, they could not move beyond bronze unless the institution had at least a bronze. And so this meant that it was moving the discussions internal to the institution as well as inside of the departments. So the question is, what is Sea Change? Sea Change is a keystone initiative of AAAS that tries to catalyze and sustain systemic institutional transformation. We're trying to create equitable and inclusive colleges and universities that can support the success of all students and scholars. We try to build the capacity of individuals and institutions to really look at these things systemically, to take a systemic approach to change. We are research-based and metrics-driven. You cannot know how far you have gone if you do not know where you have been. I will underscore that particular aspect of the comments that were made in the previous discussion. We provide a law-attentive lens. We have attorneys and policy experts who work with us because we, unlike the UK, have certain kinds of restrictions in terms of how we implement, and therefore we look at elements such as what the state referenda, what do they forbid and what do they allow? The judicial rulings, for example, those in Grutter and Gratz, those in Fisher 1 and 2, we have to always be aware and attentive to how we can develop and put in place the kinds of efforts that will be needed in order to support systemic change. We leverage the institutional context with context relevant design. That is, that what has to be done in one institution is not necessarily what has to be done in another. It is basically, it depends on where they start from in terms of the kinds of things that they have to be attentive to. We not only look at race, ethnicity, but also gender and look at issues for women of color. We know that this intersectional lens is absolutely crucial because when you disaggregate the data, you will find that at the bottom of every graph that you will find will be women of color, whether that's the number of physics PhDs or what have you. And we put in place a system, a structure, so that this isn't just one and done. You get the recognition from Sea Change for 5 years. At the end of 5 years, you must come back in to re-up for the award level that you have, or to go to the next level, to move, for example, from bronze to silver. And this is a way of supporting continuous improvement. And the umbrella that is there for Sea Change, the scaffolding that we provide, ask all of those questions, and the institutions really have to at least ask those questions of themselves about how are different groups experiencing the science programs that are in place within the institution. We use peer review as a way of addressing the applications once they come to us. We are not another intervention. We are not a check the box. We are not a ranking system, and we're not a magic bullet. The awards require deep self-assessment and an evidence-based action plan. As I said, it's subjected to peer review. We have both institutional and departmental level awards structures that we are building so that we can get top-down, bottom-up interaction. We, AAAS, are building the institutional structures, and we give the institutional awards. But we're working with disciplinary societies in developing departmental level assessments. The group that is furthest along right now is physics and astronomy. And in that case, it is the American Association of Physics Teachers. It is the APS, American Physical Society, AIP, American Institute of Physics, Optical Society, National Society of Black Physicists, National Society of Hispanic Physicists. The idea is that they are the ones who look at building the departmental level structures, because they build frameworks that are appropriate to those fields. And those are the kinds of things that really we have to pay attention to. It is not a one-size-fits-all kind of an effort. And as I indicated before, the awards are valid for up to 5 years. So self-assessment, using detailed frameworks as scaffolding that we have adapted from that for the UK to the American context. where institutions work with a change team, a team of individuals from different parts of the institutions that are having to look at different aspects of the institution, whether it's the human resources policies, whether it's promotion and tenure policies, but building on a base of institutional research to see how do we stack up when we look at all of the things that we need to look in terms of equitable, inclusive environments. They don't have to put all of this into the application. The application is a narrative that comes to AAAS at this point around the institutional awards, where they tell their story, they discuss what they plan to do and how they want to be measured. Then in terms of an action plan, this is what I'm going to do, and this is why I'm saying what I'm saying, and these are the ways that I will be able to tell that I have made progress. This is taken, as I said, into peer review. We have 3 levels of awards. Bronze, the criteria is from all awards, and this is to do a self-assessment, to collect the data, to be able to determine what it is that needs to be done. Silver representing progress that has been made, and gold representing leadership. And that is that not only have you moved your own needle, but you're basically serving as a model for other institutions. Membership in Sea Change incorporates different elements. We have an Sea Change Institute, and this is an example of some of the programming that has taken place in Sea Change Institute. The reason I point this out is because not all the institutions are going to have the knowledge of the research that actually relates to the things that they might want to undertake. And a lot of this effort was supported by the NSF, but we want to put it in a format that is then available to the research. We have a community component where there is opportunity for moderated conversations and for convenings, and to build a place for discussion around the DEI principles. And all of this, the community, the institute, and the awards are all housed under Sea Change Protocol, which is our centralized platform to support all of this. There is a biomedical component that was funded as well, in addition to the NSF support for our startup. And a number of important foundations. The real startup funding came from the Isaac Simons Foundation, who basically moved us from a gleam in the eye to actually be able to offer an initiative. But the National Institutes of Health are supporting our work around biomedicine. So the bottom line is that we need systems transformation. We can no longer just do a little patch over here or a little Band-Aid over here with gaping wounds, because that's what we have right now. Sea Change is research-based, data-driven, and people-focused. And the scaffold that we have allows for the institutions allows us to support institutional change, the kind of systemic change, the kind of internal guidance for institutions to know where they need to go, what do they need to focus on, but the external affirmation. And it is the external affirmation that the NSF can use. It is the external affirmation that a parent can use to decide where I want my kid to go to school, or a faculty member, a person who wants to sign on as a faculty member can use as an indicator that this institution cares about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have a renewal cycle of awards that supports this continuous improvement. External awards like this, especially that require rigorous self-assessment and ongoing renewal, really cultivate the long-term commitment to DEI work. And again, provide this kind of external validation. It's an external signal in recruitment, in hiring, and in philanthropy. We call it positive peer pressure is connected to metrics that matter. We think that if some institutions are recognized in this way, that their peers are going to want to get this recognition as well. So should NSF care about assessing systems? The needle hasn't moved a lot. We are still wrestling with the same kinds of issues as when I served on the science board and when I came to the AAAS many, many decades ago. Diverse, inclusive, and welcoming environments support quality science and innovation, and they maximize return on federal investment. It's impossible for me to emphasize enough that places where the climates are supportive and inclusive are places where the best work can get done. So as the agency works to build research capacity across the full range of institutions, there is an opportunity, as it were, to bake in attention to these kinds of elements as essential components of building a research environment that supports excellence in research. And so with that, I would welcome any questions.
Thank you. As usual, it's taking me a little while to come back on, but I am on. So Shirley, I'd like to take the opportunity to ask you one question before I open it up. So my question is that you've had enough time. I can see what you're suggesting we do. I can see how great this would be to address what is a systemic problem. But what kind of feedback are you getting from the institutions about how they are finding the administrative burden of this particular program? Is it overburdening the system is that what they feel? Is there a problem in finding peer-to-peer review, or is there a uniform enthusiasm for the program? I'm just asking you what the kind of feedback you're getting from people who have started using it.
People who are exploring it, okay. One of the first things they say is the administrative, there's all this data collection and what have you, and we prefer to do this other kinds of thing, or this is going to take too long, and we prefer to do something that is short term. Short term will not last. We've already done that experiment. Okay, we have done that experiment. The administrative part it can feel daunting, but they're already doing a lot of the data collection already. They have to report into iPads. They're already looking at a lot of these different kinds of elements. If they've done accreditation or they're just finished accreditation, they have had to do this. They can use a lot of the data, just port it over into a lot of the other kinds of things. But the other part is that this was work that really needs to be distributed across the institution, because it is, in fact, related to the different kinds of components that happen. So that's one thing that we hear. We do hear it is just way too much work. All right. Yeah. Then we hear that, well, the pandemic hit, we can't afford membership. The membership is pretty modest compared with and it is based on the operating budgets of the institution, but it's modest compared with what is being paid otherwise. But I remind people that if you can improve, for example, your student retention, you can, your retention in these programs, you can more than pay for what you're doing. Okay, you're losing people like crazy. Yeah. This is the ship that's taken on water, and so this is, I think that it is a way of how you have to look at this, how in fact you are looking at this as an investment. This is an investment in the long-term strength and health of their enterprise. I think that But they gotta shift the way that they look at things.
I actually am getting nervous because I see a whole ton of hands up
That's
wanting
okay,
to
I'll be quick.
And it was a fabulous presentation, but let me move it over. Ellen is going to moderate the discussion, and thank you again. It's just a great idea. We'll go forward, I think, in some ways. But Ellen, will you take over at this point?
Oh, sure, absolutely. Thank you, Anila, and thank you so much, Dr. Malcolm, for a very, very informative presentation. So let me start with Jerry.
Great, Shirley, great to see you again.
Good to see you.
Shirley, I want to be quick on this. I really like the fact that you're collecting metrics, and I'm interested in finding out if you're collecting metrics on the demographics and retention and completion rate of graduate students, because I've been pushing the board to seriously consider that those institutions that get funding from NSF need to report that kind of information so that we can compare them from institution to institution. There is Life Sciences Coalition for Next Generation Life Sciences, which is collecting this data, but it's just a small group, so it can be done. I just want to know if you've been doing something like that.
Well, in our case, what we do is that we outline what data the institution has to collect for itself. In many cases, we do not look at those data, all right, at the institutional level, but the institution needs to look at those data because they need to be able to say something about this. When I worked on graduate education issues, one of the things I found was that there was almost no conception of retention in graduate education because people just assume when people disappeared that they in fact had just decided to go off hiking. I mean, but within the context, certainly within the context of department level review, where they're drilling down on things like retention, et cetera, they are looking, the institution has the opportunity to say, we want to focus in on this, but they have to collect the data to look across the board.
Thank you, and it should be the responsibility of the graduate schools to do that. So thank you very much.
Yes.
See, Steve Willard.
Thank you, Dr. Malcolm. My theory is once a member of NSB, always a member of NSB. So you're one of us.
You notice I kept saying we.
Yes, I like that. So help us think, if you would. Broader impacts is very important to us, and we're thinking about ways that we can strengthen it, including data collection on the way out. Your comments to me were sort of focused on the individual. Do you have any thoughts, or would you share them later about how we might push broader impacts and be able to understand the results of those impacts as we collect our data?
I think that what we need to ask people, see, again, what you need to ask people is really about what were you trying to accomplish and what evidence do you have that it was accomplished? And that's just that straightforward. And I, in fact, I'm a big fan of broader impacts. I'm one of the people who stood it up within the foundation. Mm-hmm. And I think that it is a very important lever for change, for systemic change, depending on how it actually gets used. And so I applaud your efforts to start asking for measurement associated with it.
Thank you.
Let's see, Mel, you're next.
You're muted.
Can you unmute, Mel?
Dr. Malcolm, how many institutions have used Sea Change? What is the distribution of bronze, silver, and gold? And how many institutions have started and left?
Okay, all right. We are a startup. I said that we only really began in 2017. And the first thing that we had to pilot was the awards structure. So we only gave out our first awards in, I think it was 2019. And so that means that we haven't had that much time. If we want to look at impact, we look at, see what happened in the UK during this time, because they have 15 years of data. Is that right? Yes, they have 16 years of data, and they have had evaluations. And so in our case, we only have bronze institutions, and we only have 5 of them because, as I said, we had to pilot them. And they are, in case you wanted to know, Boston University, University of Massachusetts Lowell, University of California Davis, University of California Irvine, and Arizona State. And those are the ones that we have right now. I would be happy to come back in 15 years. I'd be happy to come back in 15 years, but be happy to come back in 15 years and tell you how many golds and silvers and things like this. But we, as I said, we are a startup.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I did think it was important to point out that you also offer the opportunity for people to essentially join the community.
Yes.
Without diving into the full assessment, to
Yes.
take advantage of the conversations, best
Right.
practices, try to understand how they might be part of the awards program in the future.
Yes, and the membership basically is larger than that. It's about 13 institutions, and they can be there for a while and figure out how to maneuver or learn from others. We're looking at these kinds of strategies.
Okay, we'll go to Vic next.
Dr. Malcolm, always a pleasure to see you again.
Good
How
to see
things
you.
going? My question is, have you engaged, because this is so important, a strategy to try to also get to present this to the boards of the institutions? Because as you know, everything really starts at the top beyond the president or the chancellor, and try to get to the boards of these institutions. And how can we at NSB help you?
Well, we have not undertaken this. As a matter of fact, I have been promising my staff that I'm going to do a module that for the Institute that is just about board leadership and how and why the boards ought to be asking these questions. I still have a promissory note out to do that. I would appreciate people actually talking about this to their own institutions. You can to at least explore the possibility, because I don't think we have a lot of time to waste. Your presentation on Vision 2030 essentially says that we are far behind in any case, and really need to be able to stop wasting talent. The demographics are shifting. The leadership within science, I'm concerned, is shifting. And so if you can at least say to people, just look at this, it would be appreciated.
Okay, well, I'll follow up with that with you.
Okay.
Okay, we'll go to Amelia and then Julia. And because we're starting to get short on time, may not get through all the questions. So feel free to use the chat to make comments or questions too. So Emilio.
Dr. Malcolm, I agree completely with your emphasis on the structural problem that was there and not addressed for so many years. But I'm wondering whether sea change is addressing the structural problem of guilds. I assume you're familiar with an analysis that was done by John Lombardi some years back of universities. And he characterized universities as being made up of guilds.
I know.
And there were departments being constituted as very close guilds, which are resistant to anybody, including the leadership of the university, telling them how to run their business.
Yes, I know that.
And this is if that is not addressed, and you only address the administration of the university in trying to change things, we're probably going to fail again, because we don't think of ourselves as guilds, but we are. And certainly when you run a department, you can see how it resists, the dean and the presidents of the universities all the time. They think they are the authority on what is quality, and the disciplines function that way, like a mega guild as well.
I totally agree with you, and that is the reason that we are building a structure that is top down and bottom up. We want departmental change at the same time that we're getting institutional change. And if the physics and astronomy community are working together to say, this isn't acceptable that in fact that the numbers have not moved in 30 years, that it isn't acceptable anymore in light of the kinds of challenges in Vision 30. That is what we hope. We also hope that the peer pressure between institutions, if one of those headline institutions basically gets the award, it's going to be difficult for the other one to not go after it. And we want to use the guild structure basically as a positive peer driver.
Okay.
Juliet.
Yes, thank you, Shirley. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you.
I was wondering well, first of all, it appears to me that there are some pretty good parallels in terms of the process, the self-assessment, so forth and so on, with many things that are done in the private sector, for example, in environmental safety and health, or in processes, Lean Six Sigma and that kind of thing.
Right.
And so and that leads me to ask the question whether the private sector and the engagements between the private sector and the universities might be a way of, conveying the value of these self-assessments and collecting the data, and self-improvement and all of that kind of thing, as well as the private sector being a major employer of the products of the universities. And therefore, I think that it might be beneficial to work on seeing what you could do to get the private sector pushing for this as well.
We are working on that. We are trying to get corporate partners. We are trying to, and we're also trying to influence private philanthropy, because that is another way to basically put a lever in place to say that this is valued. This is valued. And we want to go to places where we know we can bring in people that have experienced highly productive, highly successful, highly inclusive environments.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Malcom. Thank you to the Committee on Oversight for bringing Dr. Malcom to our board today. I'm sorry, especially Suresh and Maureen, that we didn't get to your questions. Again, feel free to use the chat or other means by which we can continue this conversation.
Well, if people have questions, they can just email me.
Absolutely.
I've been answering a lot of questions on email about all of this.
Of course, I just know that I think the whole board can benefit, from what we hear. So we definitely want to continue the conversation. And I'm sure Anila will help do that as well.
Welcome home.